June 26, 1944. Light rain fell on the red dirt airstrips of Hollandia, Dutch New Guinea, as the distant sound of a game of checkers was interrupted by a sharp knock on the wire screen. Lieutenant Colonel Charles MacDonald, commander of the 475th Fighter Group, the legendary Satan's Angels, looked up from the board. On the other side of the door, a thin man with a calm expression introduced himself in a low, firm voice. It took a few seconds for the name to register in MacDonald's mind, distracted as he was by the strategy of the game. Charles Lindbergh, the visitor repeated. The Charles Lindbergh, the same man who, 17 years earlier, had crossed the Atlantic alone in the spirit of St. Louis, turning the impossible into achievement. Now he was there, in civilian clothes, thousands of miles from home, asking permission to discuss combat operations for the P-38 Lightning. What MacDonald did not know at that mundane moment was that this meeting would forever change the way American fighters would fly in the Pacific, and how the enemy would see them. Lindbergh's presence in a theater of war was, in itself, an anomaly. He was not a military man. After becoming the national hero of 1927, he had spent the 1930s exploring new air routes for Pan American Airways. His flights over the Pacific and Atlantic had taught him something that few understood. Each engine had a precise point of balance, a symphony of pressure, rotation, and fuel mixture that, when achieved, could multiply an aircraft's range without requiring a single extra drop of fuel. This obsession with efficiency, born from his Atlantic crossing, had become his trademark. But World War II had turned Lindbergh into a divided man. His isolationist stance before Pearl Harbor had made him persona non grata in Washington. President Roosevelt considered him a sympathizer of the enemy. Lindbergh, for his part, believed that America should not fight a European war. In 1941, publicly humiliated, he resigned his commission in the Air Force Reserve. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, he tried to return to service, but Roosevelt personally blocked his return. The man who had been the greatest symbol of American aviation was forbidden to wear his country's uniform. However, the war needed brains, and Lindbergh's knowledge of engines and fuel consumption was unmatched. So he found a loophole. He became a civilian consultant to the United Aircraft Corporation, a fighter plane manufacturer. He worked with engineers at Chance Vought, helping to perfect the Corsair, analyzed production problems with the B-24 Liberator, and conducted high-altitude test flights with the P-47 Thunderbolt. Each civilian mission brought him closer, little by little, to the front lines he so desperately wanted to cross. He wanted to fly in combat. He wanted to prove, once again, that precision and discipline could defeat brute force. On April 3, 1944, he got what he wanted: authorization, discreet, almost secret, to accompany Navy and Air Force units in the Pacific. Officially, he would be a technical observer. In practice, he would fly. To the American public, he remained at home. To the military command, he was a useful but troublesome guest. Neither President Roosevelt nor the Secretary of the Navy knew that Lindbergh was on his way to war. He left San Diego discreetly, wearing a naval uniform without insignia and carrying a small New Testament in his luggage. "It's the only book I'm taking," he wrote in his diary. "10 years ago, I would have chosen another, but the more I learn, the more I realize it has little competition." It was a quiet confession of faith and purpose, the rational man seeking meaning in the irrationality of human conflict. Upon arriving in the South Pacific, Lindbergh began flying with the Marines. He participated in F-4U Corsair attack missions against Japanese garrisons in Rabaul. There, he did what he knew best. He observed, measured, and adjusted. In a few days, he taught the pilots to take off with bomb loads well above the nominal weight without sacrificing safety. He redefined how the Corsair handled power and weight. His instructions reduced accidents and increased the unit's attack power. The news spread quickly. Old Lindy, the man of the Atlantic, was flying real combat missions and solving problems that factory engineers had never solved. But Lindbergh wanted more. The Corsair fascinated him, but there was one machine that piqued his technical curiosity: the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, a uniquely appearing fighter. 2 long nacelles, twin engines, and a cockpit suspended between them. It was the only American aircraft that combined power, stability, and range. If there was one aircraft capable of turning his theory of efficiency into concrete results, it was the Lightning. In June 1944, he traveled to northern New Guinea, seeking out the 475th Fighter Group, the most respected P-38 squadron in the Pacific Theater. The Satan's Angels had become a living legend: victorious combat, experienced pilots, and a commander, Charles MacDonald, known for both his courage and his skepticism. Lindbergh arrived in Hollandia without fanfare, with only an informal authorization from General Ennis Whitehead, Deputy Commander of the 5th Air Force. On that gray afternoon, MacDonald was playing checkers with Operations Officer Merrill Smith when the shadow of a civilian appeared at the door. The introduction was brief, and the ensuing silence was thick with disbelief. "Are you the Charles Lindbergh?" Smith asked, rising slowly. Lindbergh just smiled. He was there to observe the P-38's operations, but what he really wanted was to fly. The scene could have ended with a polite farewell. A curious civilian, a retired hero, an icon out of place. But MacDonald, realizing the name he had before him, decided to listen to him. Lindbergh spoke with the precision of an engineer and the serenity of someone who had crossed oceans alone. In a few minutes, he convinced the colonel that he was not just a visitor to the office. "Would you like to fly with us tomorrow?" asked MacDonald. Lindbergh replied with a simple yes. That night, the camp was abuzz with rumors. The pilots, many half Lindbergh's age, speculated whether the national hero could fly a modern fighter plane. "Can he still handle it?" one of them scoffed. Others viewed his arrival with reverence. The man who had challenged the Atlantic would now sleep in a tent alongside the young men who risked their lives every day. The next day dawned with rain and anticipation. When the weather finally cleared, 4 P-38s taxied down the coral runway toward takeoff. MacDonald led, followed by Merrill Smith, Thomas Maguire, an ace with 15 victories, and Lindbergh, flying as Blue 3. The propellers spun in sync, the nacelles gleamed in the tropical sun, and the civilian in third place in the formation looked as natural as any other pilot. The debut mission would be simple: armed reconnaissance over Caibos Bay, a nest of enemy vessels. But when the P-38s dove in a low-level flight and the machine guns spat fire, Lindbergh proved he wasn't just there to watch. He followed the formation with pinpoint accuracy, dodged anti-aircraft fire, and hit the target with lethal efficiency. Upon landing, the silence of the return said more than any report. What would follow could not be predicted by any manual, nor by the German spies who studied the range of the American Air Forces with spreadsheets and statistics. In a matter of days, the mechanics would notice something that defied all expectations. While the other pilots returned with their tanks almost empty, Lindbergh's P-38 returned with fuel to spare. He had done the impossible without changing a single part, just with an invisible adjustment, a small deviation in the way he thought about the engine. A trick so simple and at the same time so devastating that if the Germans had known what was about to happen, they would have understood. America's flying demons were about to be born. The mystery began on the dirt floor of the Hollandia field. Every time Charles Lindbergh's P-38 landed, the mechanics approached curiously. The tank caps were still wet, and the fuel gauges pointed to something impossible. While the other pilots returned with their reserves almost depleted, the middle-aged civilian flying alongside them brought back hundreds of extra liters. In combat, everyone used the same rotations, the same mixture settings, the same altitudes, and yet Lindbergh seemed to manipulate the air in a different way. That couldn't be a coincidence. 2 days later, Colonel Charles MacDonald called an informal meeting in the group's makeshift lounge, a simple space with a thatched roof, dirt floor, and bare light bulbs hanging from crooked wires. The pilots arrived in silence, some still skeptical, others just curious. In the center, Lindbergh stood waiting, with the same restrained air of someone who always preferred precision to spectacle. When MacDonald asked him to explain the trick, the old aviator's voice sounded calm, almost didactic, but what he said seemed to contradict everything those men had learned since basic training. According to the manual, the P-38 should be kept cruising at 2,200 revolutions per minute, with the mixture set to auto-rich and pressure at 27 to 29 inches of mercury. These were safe, stable settings, guaranteed by the factory. Lindbergh, however, began to draw an invisible curve in the air between consumption and power. He explained that the secret was not to fly faster, but to find the exact point where the engine worked with minimum effort and maximum efficiency. He proposed something that sounded almost heretical: reduce the revolutions to 1,600 per minute, open the throttle a little more, up to 30 inches, and switch the mixture to auto lean. It seemed like a complete reversal of safety logic. Fewer revolutions, more pressure. This way, he said, each piston cycle generates more energy and burns less fuel. The plane remains fast, but drinks slowly. At the back of the room, one pilot muttered, "That's going to blow up the engine." Another nodded in agreement. They had all learned that running over square, that is, with pressure greater than the number of revolutions, was a sure way to destroy valves and cause overheating. Lindbergh was not irritated. He picked up a piece of paper and made a quick calculation. He showed that the P-38 engine was designed to withstand 60 inches of pressure in combat, and that, at 30, the strain was modest. The danger came from the temperature, not the ratio between rotation and pressure, and the lower rotation actually reduced friction and kept the engine cooler. It was pure thermodynamic. The silence lingered. Many still had their doubts, but no one dared to openly challenge the man who had crossed the Atlantic alone. Colonel MacDonald ended the meeting by simply saying, "Let's test it." The first flights took place under tension. Each pilot chose a short route, ready to return if something went wrong. The engines roared differently with a deeper, more measured tone, but none of them broke down. The temperature and pressure gauges remained within normal limits, and upon landing, the fuel gauges confirmed Lindbergh's math. Consumption had plummeted. The average savings exceeded 30%, something Lockheed engineers would have called a miracle if it hadn't been documented in flight hours. As the days passed, skepticism gave way to curiosity. Pilots began to apply the technique in real missions. The result was immediate. The P-38's range jumped from just over 900 to nearly 1,200 kilometers. Now the fighters could accompany bombers to targets previously considered out of reach. At the next briefing, Lindbergh showed detailed notes. At 1,600 RPM and 30 inches of pressure, flying at 185 miles per hour, the P-38 consumed about 70 gallons per hour, compared to 100 or more in traditional mode. In practical terms, it was as if the plane had gained an extra tank without adding a single gram of weight. From then on, missions began to last 7, 8, sometimes 9 hours. Flights that used to end with pilots praying to see the runway before their tanks ran dry now ended with fuel to spare. This safety margin changed everything. The Lightnings could stay longer over the target, improvise new routes, and react to the enemy with unprecedented freedom. Air warfare in the Pacific, dominated by vast distances, had just been redesigned. But the news did not spread without resistance. Some commanders considered it imprudent to officially adopt a method taught by a civilian. Others feared premature wear on the Allison V-1710 engines. There was also the psychological factor, admitting that a stranger in the hierarchy, without rank or insignia, had found such a simple solution, meant recognizing that military doctrine could be wrong. Even so, the evidence was mounting. Fuel consumption reports, temperature readings, and performance showed unquestionable numbers. The impossible had become routine. Over the following weeks, Lindbergh flew side by side with the young men of the 475th. He didn't talk much, but he observed everything. He corrected a touch of the throttle, an adjustment of the mixture, the angle of a turn. His gaze, more that of an engineer than a hero, saw aviation as a science of millimeter. On nights when the sky remained clear, he would sit alone beside the runway and take measurements, comparing altitude, temperature, and fuel consumption. The man who had once crossed the Atlantic, guided only by wind calculations and a compass, now applied the same reasoning to war, turning statistics into survival. The results began to echo beyond Hollandia. Other P-38 groups heard rumors of a Lindbergh mode, and soon engineering officers requested formal reports. What had begun as a curiosity among pilots became a technical revolution. Suddenly, the idea that the Lightning was limited by its range dissipated, and enemies, both in the Pacific and in Europe, would discover the hard way that the short wings of American fighters had grown longer. To those watching from afar, it seemed like a miracle. To Lindbergh, it was just the disciplined application of logic. Every drop of fuel had its own rhythm. You just had to listen to it. He used to say that flying well is like breathing with the engine. The phrase sounded poetic, but it concealed a precise line of reasoning. When you understand the machine in depth, flying ceases to be a struggle against limits and becomes a dialogue with efficiency. Colonel MacDonald, ever the pragmatist, summed up the discovery in terms his men would understand. Now we can go where they don't think we can go. And he was right. The Japanese, accustomed to measuring the P-38's response time by known distances, could not understand how American fighters appeared so far away, in places theoretically out of reach, and still remained over the target. It was as if the enemy had acquired an invisible power, a minor adjustment that transformed it into something supernatural. If the Luftwaffe in Europe had known about these flights, they would have called the Lightnings flying demons, machines that defied the laws of fuel and probability. At the end of that week, the unit's report showed impressive numbers. Missions extended by almost 400 miles, average fuel consumption reduced by a third, and no damaged engine. The technique, once seen as dangerous daring, had become standard procedure within the group. The impossible had become method, and the method, doctrine. Amidst all this, Lindbergh remained the same reserved man, averse to glory. When someone praised him, he would simply reply, "I didn't make the plane fly farther. The plane showed me how." His quiet humility only increased the respect of those who flew with him. It was hard not to feel that they were witnessing something greater than simple fuel economy. Over time, even the younger pilots began to imitate him. Some adjusted the tone of their voices on the radio, trying to reproduce the same slow and precise rhythm. Others adopted his checklist and note-taking habits. One day, a pilot joked, "It seems that old Lindy has hypnotized us." MacDonald replied, "No, he taught us how to think." During those weeks of learning and adaptation, the 475th was transformed, and without realizing it, those pilots were also learning another lesson, not just about engines, but about mindset. War often rewards courage, but sometimes what changes the course of a battle is simply a mind willing to question the manual. The echo of that historic moment would cross borders and decades. Every future innovation in long-range flight, from strategic bombers to transcontinental civilian aircraft, would invisibly bear the signature of the man who dared to adjust the throttle down and the pressure up. Such a small adjustment, yet capable of changing the map of war. As the sun set over the mountains of New Guinea, the sound of the engines faded into the distance, echoing like a new kind of heartbeat, steady, efficient, relentless. A civilian's trick had become the secret that would transform the P-38s into almost mythical creatures of the sky, machines that seemed to defy time and space, and which, in the eyes of their enemies, began to look like true metal demons. And at this point, it's worth checking if you're already subscribed to our channel. For the weeks following the Hollandia meeting were a laboratory in the midst of the battlefield. The pilots of the 475th Group began to apply the Lindbergh mode systematically, and what had previously seemed like a technical curiosity became a true paradigm shift. Now, missions took off with the confidence of those who knew there was room for the unexpected. Where once the fear of an empty tank limited range and initiative, now there was freedom. Fuel, once calculated with agonizing precision, had become an ally. The first major test came in early July 1944. The target was distant, almost at the limit of the P-38's previous range. The operation required 6.5 hours of flight time, more than 1,000 kilometers across the sea and the jungles of New Guinea, to enemy bases in Gilvink Bay. It was the kind of mission that, months earlier, would have been considered impractical. Lindbergh took off together, in formation, using exactly the same settings he had taught. When the aircraft returned, the result was shocking. The younger pilots landed with their gauges in the red, while the civilian, calm, still had more than 200 gallons of fuel left. The mechanics recorded the data, the officers compared spreadsheets, and the conclusion was indisputable. The man who had crossed the Atlantic alone had just proven that he could also bend the limits of the most advanced American fighter. In a few days, the trick became standard in the 475th, and with it came a new kind of confidence. Not the arrogance of technological superiority, but the serenity of those who master their own instrument. The effect was immediate in subsequent operations. On July 3rd, a formation of P-38s took off to escort B-25 bombers over Jeffman Island. After the attack, the pilots were ordered to hunt for enemy barges along the coast. Normally, this would mean returning immediately after the escort, at the risk of running out of fuel, but not on that mission. While two planes turned for home, Lindbergh remained. The hours accumulated, and when he landed, he still had enough fuel for another entire trip. It was then that MacDonald, the commander, realized the magnitude of the discovery. The 475th was no longer just a fighter group. It was a long-range force, capable of projecting air power where only bombers had dared to go before, and then the war showed its most unpredictable face. On July 28, 1944, Lindbergh took off with the 433rd Squadron on an escort and reconnaissance mission in LPD Bay. The sky was clear, and the group was flying in tight formation, when two dark spots appeared in the distance, cutting through the blue. Two Mitsubishi Ki-51 Sonya, Japanese reconnaissance planes. They were slow and fragile but piloted by veterans. One of them was commanded by Captain Saburo Shimada, an experienced ace who did not intend to give up his life easily. The chase began like so many others. Dives, tight turns, the metallic sound of cannons. But Shimada maneuvered with surprising skill, using the agility of his small plane to avoid the P-38s. The Americans made several unsuccessful passes. Then, suddenly, the Japanese changed tactics. Facing the American formation, he accelerated on a direct collision course with Lindbergh's plane. The crash seemed inevitable. For a moment, the world was reduced to two silhouettes, approaching at over 500 miles per hour. Lindbergh maintained control, aimed at the enemy's radial engine, and pulled the trigger. The nose of the P-38 spat out a torrent of fire, 4 50-caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon firing in unison. Within seconds, the Ki-51's propeller slowed, black smoke poured from the cowling, and the enemy plane nosedived. Shimada tried to recover, but it was too late. The impact with the sea raised a column of white foam that disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. On the radio, no one spoke for a few seconds. Death in the air had this particular silence, a kind of involuntary respect that followed the flash of fire. When they returned to base, the kill was recorded discreetly, without fanfare. Lindbergh was a civilian. Officially, he could not receive credit for an aerial victory, but everyone knew. The man who had taught them to fly farther had just proven that he also knew how to fight. The news spread quickly among American units. The legendary aviator had shot down an enemy in actual combat. For the young pilots, who saw him as an almost mythical figure, the feat erased any remaining doubts. Lindbergh was not just the teacher of fuel economy, he was one of them. The myth of the old man watching from the ground disappeared. The hero of the Atlantic was now also a warrior of the Pacific. But war rarely allows for rest. Just 3 days later, on August 1st, Lindbergh nearly died. During a sweep over the Palau Islands, his squadron encountered a group of Japanese Zero fighters. In the heat of battle, he entered a tight spin with a lighter, more maneuverable enemy. For seconds, the Zero was on his tail, ready to fire. It was MacDonald, watching from a distance, who spotted the danger. He shouted into the radio, "Break right! Now!" Lindbergh obeyed, diving sharply, and the commander opened fire on the Zero chasing him. The enemy burst into flames. When they landed, MacDonald said nothing. He just looked at him and nodded. This incident was the turning point. The High Command decided it was time to send him back. Lindbergh had already flown about 50 combat missions, 25 of them in P-38s. His contribution was consolidated, but the risk of losing him, a famous civilian in the middle of a war zone, was unacceptable. On August 12, 1944, he left Hollandia for the United States. At the camp, the pilots gathered to see him off. There were no speeches, just handshakes and silent glances. He had arrived as an observer and was leaving as a comrade. For the Satan's Angel, Lindbergh's absence did not mean the end of his influence. On the contrary, his technique was already integrated into their routine. What was once a secret among a few was now spreading throughout the 5th Air Force. Groups of P-38s at other bases began to report the same improvement, the same numbers, the same stories of long and safe missions. Confidence in the engines increased, dependence on short routes decreased, and little by little American fighters began to appear in places the enemy considered unreachable. The Japanese, accustomed to calculating flight times and distances from American bases, began to notice something different. There were more patrols, more simultaneous attacks, more escorts that remained in the air long after expected. It wasn't just strategy, it was applied physics. A minimal adjustment to the throttles and mixtures had doubled the P-38's stamina, and the psychological effect was devastating. What had seemed like a limited fleet now moved like an invisible swarm, appearing from unexpected directions and disappearing before there was time to react. For the pilots of the 475th, each new mission was a reminder of the transformation they had undergone. Discipline mingled with reverence. They no longer saw their tanks as restrictions, but as promises. How many more miles they could pull, how many extra minutes they could fight. The vast and merciless Pacific sky seemed a little smaller, and with each rhythmic roar of the engine, the silent lesson left by the man who had taught them to do the impossible with what they already had echoed. Lindbergh had left the front, but his method would continue to shape the course of the war. He proved that intelligence can be as lethal a weapon as any cannon, and in doing so, he gave American aviation a new kind of power, not based on speed or firepower, but on range, endurance, and precision, a power that transformed ordinary pilots into long-range predators, invisible demons that enemies could not predict. That summer of 1944, amid the roar of twin engines and the stifling heat of New Guinea, a simple idea had become a strategic weapon. One man, armed only with knowledge and courage, had taught an entire air force to fly beyond its limits, and without realizing it, had redefined the very notion of air supremacy. What had begun with an interrupted game of checkers now ended as an invisible revolution in the skies. The hero of the past was leaving the battlefield, but the echoes of his precision would continue to resonate in every flight that took off from the coral runways, carrying on the legacy of an adjustment so simple that even the enemies, not even the Germans watching the American advance from afar, could have predicted that it would be enough to transform the P-38s into true demons of the air. When Charles Lindbergh left Hollandia in August 1944, the silence that remained in the camp seemed greater than the sky above New Guinea. The men of the 475th knew they had witnessed something that went beyond mere technical efficiency. A civilian, banned from military service, had taught the greatest aces in the Pacific to defy the mathematics of war. In the days following his departure, the Lindbergh method continued to spread, first informally, through conversations between pilots, then in technical reports, mechanics' notes, and improvised instructions before missions. Within a few weeks, the technique ceased to be a unit secret and became standard operating procedure. The results were visible on the maps. Lines that had previously ended in red dots, the theoretical limit of the P-38's range, now extended hundreds of miles beyond. Pilots called it the New Horizon. 9-hour missions, once unthinkable, became routine. Japanese bases, which had been chosen because they were out of range of American escort, began to fall one by one under the fire of the lightning. The enemy's air doctrine was dismantled because it was based on a miscalculation. It believed that factory manuals were unquestionable. In practice, the impact was profound. The P-38s could now escort bombers on much more distant attacks, covering targets that previously required risky unprotected flights. This saved countless lives. It also meant that the American advance across the Pacific, the long string of islands leading to the Philippines, could be accelerated. In October 1944, when MacArthur's troops landed on Leyte, Lightning fighters were already there, flying from distant fields in Morotai and New Guinea, staying over the target with fuel to spare. The difference between arriving with empty tanks and arriving with an hour's reserve was the difference between surviving and disappearing into the sea. In internal reports, commanders began to record the new reality. Lindbergh's technique increased the P-38's range by about 30%. With external tanks, the range exceeded 1,000 miles. This transformed not only the battlefield but air strategy as a whole. The Lightnings were no longer short-range escort fighters, but became instruments of deep attack. The enemy could now be surprised in places they considered safe. The feeling, for those who faced these endless patrols of silver metal, was almost supernatural. They appeared out of nowhere, remained in the sky for hours, and then disappeared over the horizon. That is why, in Japanese interception reports, the P-38 began to be nicknamed Hakai Teki no Oni, the destructive demon. Even within the American command, acceptance of the method was not immediate. Some senior officers doubted the reliability of the engines under these flight conditions. Others feared that the civilian intruder was encouraging a violation of safety regulations. But the war did not wait for administrative debates. The numbers spoke louder. No engines suffered catastrophic failures, and fuel consumption continued to surprise. In October, the command made the new cruising guidelines official. Low RPM, high pressure, lean mixture. Lindbergh's technique became doctrine. What was once daring became procedure. When the conflict ended, the consequences of that small change proved immense. The increased range of the P-38s helped sustain the air offensive that ensured rapid advances in the Pacific. It reduced losses, increased the autonomy of operations, and gave the Allied forces an invisible but decisive logistical advantage. And the most ironic thing is that all this came not from a factory or a laboratory, but from the mind of a man who had been excluded from the war. Lindbergh returned to the United States without fanfare. He continued to work as a technical consultant, evaluating captured aircraft and participating in conferences on air performance. In public, he rarely spoke about his participation in the Pacific, perhaps because he knew that the story of a civilian shooting down planes and changing military procedures was uncomfortable for the authorities. But his diaries, published decades later, revealed the magnitude of what he had done. He not only increased the range of an airplane, he redefined what it meant to understand a machine. On a human level, the lesson was even more profound. Lindbergh showed that hierarchy can bow to knowledge, that courage is not only about facing the enemy, but also about challenging the manual, that the power of the technical mind, when tested in the field, can change the course of a war. The U.S. Air Force learned from him that a manual is only the starting point, never the limit, and the pilots who flew alongside him kept, until the end of their lives, the memory of a man who, in silence, proved that thinking differently can be as decisive as shooting first. The 475th Group ended the war as the most victorious among the P-38 units, with more than 550 confirmed kills. Among its aces was Major Thomas Maguire, who would achieve 38 victories, the second highest number of the entire war. None of these feats would have been possible without the quiet transformation that began on that June day in Hollandia, when a civilian interrupted a game of checkers and changed the way the skies would be conquered. In the years that followed, the P-38 would be replaced by the P-51 Mustang on many fronts, but in the Pacific it remained irreplaceable. Its twin engines, stability, and, above all, its range ensured that it remained a vital tool until the last days of the conflict. When peace came, pilots looked at the Lightnings parked on the runways and knew that each one carried, invisibly, the signature of Lindbergh, the man who proved that sometimes the greatest advance comes not from a new machine, but from a new way of using it. Decades later, when historians revisited the Pacific campaigns, they realized that this simple change in procedure had shortened the duration of many operations by months. The island-hopping strategy, which took American forces to the Philippines and then to Japan, depended on fighters capable of covering distances that were previously impossible. Each conquered island needed air cover, and Lindbergh's method made this feasible sooner. Efficiency became a strategic advantage. For the Germans, attentive observers of every Allied innovation, the Lindbergh case would have been disturbing had they known the details, because it showed that American war power lay not only in mass production, but in the ability to improve what already existed, to exploit every last ounce of potential hidden in a machine. If at the beginning of the war the P-38 was just a good fighter, now it was a symbol of what the enemy least expected: intelligence applied to improvisation. A simple adjustment had transformed what was limited into something supernatural, and no enemy expected that the difference between losing and winning could fit into a few millimeters of movement on the throttle. Lindbergh died in 1974 in Maui, surrounded by the same serenity that had accompanied him in life. His simple grave bears an inscription from Psalm 139. "If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea." It was a perfect metaphor. He lived and died with the conviction that understanding flight was also understanding the human spirit, and that true revolution never comes from the noise of weapons, but from the silence of ideas applied with precision. While enemies imagined flying demons crossing the sky, the real power was not in myth, but in the mind. One man, one calculation, one different choice, and the fate of a war changes. What do you think might have been different if the American command had trusted Lindbergh from the beginning? Would the war have ended sooner? Or perhaps he would never have had the freedom necessary to prove his theory? Enjoy the video, share it with those who also like to understand the hidden side of historical events, and subscribe to the channel to follow the upcoming documentaries that reveal the secrets behind the facts that shaped the world.